In the summer of 1991, the quiet streets of Milwaukee were about to be shaken to their core. A desperate escape by one terrified young man would finally end the reign of Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee cannibal.
I was saving body parts such as skulls and skeletons, and eventually I did turn to cannibalism.
For years, Dahmer had lured his victims into his apartment, manipulating and drugging them.
I'd have the sleeping pill mixture already prepared. The person would drink it, fall asleep, and that's when they would be strangled.
No one had ever escaped his grasp until Tracy Edwards did. His survival led the police to a scene so horrifying, it revealed the dark truth about the man behind the facade of normalcy.
I just want to take pictures of you, and stuff like that. And then he said, I want you to go in the refrigerator and get another beer. So therefore he stood me up with the handcuff, with the loose one on my hand. He grabbed that, and he still had the knife at me, and he guided me towards the refrigerator. I opened the refrigerator there, and there the skulls was, and a heart, and a hand. And he said, "That's beautiful, isn't it?"
Dahmer's spree had lasted for over a decade, leaving 17 victims in its wake. But it was Edwards who became the key to exposing the unimaginable terror that had gone unnoticed for far too long. But who is Jeffrey Dahmer? How did this seemingly quiet, unremarkable man become one of America's most infamous serial killers? To uncover the answer, we must go back to where it all began. From his troubled childhood to his descent into madness.
Killing that excited you, or is it what happened after the killing?
No, the killing was just a means to an end. That was the least satisfactory part. I didn't enjoy doing that. That's why I tried to create living zombies with muriatic acid in the drill.
This is the story of a man who hid his true nature behind a facade of normalcy, luring his victims with charm and manipulation.
I was very good by that point at convincing adults.
Join us as we delve into the twisted mind of Jeffrey Dahmer, piecing together his dark journey from his first act of violence to his gruesome killing spree that lasted over a decade. Conorak was just 14, and he was running for his life. This was his one shot to escape the awful-smelling apartment where the strange, blonde man had given him some powerful drug. It felt like luck was on his side when he started to wake up, just as the blonde man had stepped out of the apartment. He used every ounce of strength he had to get up and reach the door. His mind was spinning, and panic gripped him so tightly that it didn't matter he was naked. This was his one and only chance to escape with his life. He was acting purely on instinct, desperate to get away and run for his life. It was just before 2 a.m. when Sandra Smith called 911, reporting a boy running around completely naked. She didn't know who he was, but it was clear he was badly hurt and scared out of his mind. The paramedics arrived first, quickly wrapping a blanket around the confused, naked boy. Soon after, 2 police officers showed up, trying to make sense of what was happening with this young man of Asian descent. Sandra Smith, 18, and her cousin Nicole Childress, also 18, stood nearby, watching as the scene unfolded. The tall blonde man was also near the boy. Tensions grew as a heated argument erupted between the girls, the blonde man, and the police.
What's going on? Do you know this kid? Yes, sir. This is my boyfriend.
Boyfriend?
The blonde man claimed that Conorak was his 19-year-old lover, insisting that he'd been drinking too much. Conorak, still drugged and barely able to think clearly, couldn't refute the calm, convincing words of the blonde man. Dahmer handed the police a picture ID. The 2 young women, however, tried to step in. The girls had seen the frightened boy struggling to get away from the blonde man before the police arrived. They were furious and upset. Yet the police dismissed their concerns, choosing to listen to the calm, white man instead.
The guy lives with me. You can come inside. I'll prove it.
To be cautious, the 2 officers decided to follow the boy and the tall blonde man to his apartment. The apartment had a terrible smell, but it was surprisingly neat. Conorak's clothes were folded neatly and placed on the sofa. A couple of photographs of Conorak in black bikini briefs lay around. Conorak sat silently on the sofa, unable to speak coherently. It was unclear if he even understood the calm explanation the blonde man was giving to the police. The blonde man was apologizing, saying his lover had caused a disturbance, promising it wouldn't happen again. The police believed him, with no reason to question his story. He was articulate, intelligent, and very calm. The Asian boy, on the other hand, appeared drunk and incoherent. The officers, not wanting to interfere in a domestic argument between two lovers, left with Conorak still sitting silently on the sofa. In that neighborhood, the officers felt there were more urgent matters to attend to, and because of these urgencies, the police missed seeing that in the bedroom was the decomposing body of Tony Hughes, who had been lying dead on the bed for 3 days. What they didn't see was the blonde man preparing to strangle the Asian boy and violate his corpse. What they failed to notice were the photos the blonde man had taken of the dead body, the grisly dismemberment that followed, and the skull he had cleaned to keep as a trophy. They also missed the chance to examine the ID that Dahmer had shown them. Had they taken this matter seriously, they would have discovered that the well-spoken man was a convicted child molester still on probation. But the story didn't end there. The two girls, ignored by the police, returned to Sandra Smith's mother, Glenda Cleveland, 36, who lived next to the Oxford apartments where Jeffrey Dahmer called home. Later, Cleveland called the officers to ask what had happened to the Asian boy. She even asked how old the child was. "It's not a child, it's an adult," the officer said. When she pressed further, he responded, "Ma, I can't make it any clearer. It's all taken care of. He's with his boyfriend in his boyfriend's apartment. I'm as sure as I can be. I can't do anything about someone's sexual preferences." A couple of days later, Cleveland called the officers again after reading about the disappearance of a Laotian boy named Conorak Synthasamphone, who looked exactly like the boy she had seen trying to escape from Dahmer's apartment. But the police never followed up with her. She even reached out to the FBI office in Milwaukee, but nothing came of it. That was until a couple of months later, on Monday, July 22, 1991, when everything changed. Two Milwaukee police officers were driving through the high-crime area near Marquette University. The heat was stifling, and the humidity made it almost unbearable. The neighborhood's smell was even more pungent in the heat, garbage littering the streets, urine and feces left by the homeless, the sour stench of greasy food. Around midnight, as the two officers sat in their car, they noticed a short, wiry black man with a handcuff dangling from his wrist. Thinking he had escaped from another officer, they asked the man what he was doing. He started telling them about this strange guy who had put the cuffs on him in his apartment. His name was Tracy Edwards. Edwards' story sounded like a typical homosexual encounter, something the police would usually ignore, but the officers decided to check out the man who had cuffed him. The man lived at the Oxford Apartments, 924 North 25th Street. The door to apartment 213 was opened by a pleasant-looking 31-year-old blonde man. Dahmer was calm and collected. Dahmer offered to retrieve the key to the handcuffs from the bedroom. Edwards recalled that the knife Dahmer had threatened him with was also in there. One of the officers decided to enter the bedroom and take a look. The officer spotted photographs scattered around the room that shocked him: dismembered human bodies and skulls in the refrigerator. Regaining his composure, he shouted to his partner to cuff Dahmer and arrest him. The calm, collected blonde man suddenly turned aggressive and fought back as the other officer tried to restrain him. As one officer subdued Dahmer, the other went to the refrigerator and opened it. He gasped in horror when he saw a face staring back at him and slammed the door shut. "There's a freaking head in the refrigerator," he yelled. A closer inspection of the apartment revealed a disturbing contrast: tidiness alongside unspeakable horrors. Despite the small one-bedroom flat being neat and clean, especially for a bachelor and his pet fish well cared for, the overpowering smell of decomposition filled the air. A box of baking soda in the refrigerator did little to mask the stench of a decaying, severed head. The freezer contained 3 more heads, each stored neatly in plastic bags and secured with twist ties. A door led to the bedroom, closet, and bathroom, the latter of which had been outfitted with a deadbolt lock. Annie E. Schwartz, the reporter who was first on the scene, described the chilling discovery in her book, The Man Who Could Not Kill Enough. At the back of the closet was a metal stockpot containing decomposed hands and a severed penis. Above the kettle were 2 skulls. The closet also contained containers of ethyl alcohol, chloroform, and formaldehyde, along with glass jars holding male genitalia preserved in formaldehyde. Polaroid photos taken by Dahmer captured various stages of his victims' deaths. One photo showed a man's head, still with flesh intact, lying in a sink. Another showed a victim sliced open from neck to groin, like a deer gutted after a hunt. The cut was so clean, the pelvic bone was clearly visible. Some photos showed his victims before they were killed, posed in various erotic and bondage positions. The police, the county medical examiner, the media, the families of missing young men, Jeff Dahmer's family, the city of Milwaukee, and the world struggled to comprehend what had transpired in apartment 213.
Think about victims' parents in a case like Jeffrey's, but we don't often think about the parents whose child committed crimes like this. What's it been like for you?
Well, it's been horrendous. I don't know if I have words to explain something that was never seen or forecast or expected. I learned about Jeff in the same way everyone else did. A friend called me and told me it had been on television in another state. And so half an hour later I turned the television on and saw his picture. And at that point, what do? You can't believe what's happening. And you cry and you grab a friend, and that's what I did. What was most unusual about it was that I didn't know, I hadn't been in contact with Jeff, although I tried, and yet no one had ever let me know that Jeff had been in any kind of trouble at all during the year.
Eventually, the horrifying truth began to surface. The first person to dive into the depths of Jeffrey Dahmer's twisted world was Detective Patrick Kennedy. A burly man with a dramatic handlebar mustache, Kennedy won Dahmer's trust and became the first to whom he confessed the gruesome details of his 13-year killing spree.
Because I noticed that he was drunk, and a couple of times during the thing he would blurt out, I can't believe this has happened to me. And I'd say, what are you talking about? He goes, I can't believe I'm sitting here. I can't believe I got caught. And I said, well, what did you think? He goes, well, I just got drunk. He goes, I lost control. I just got drunk, otherwise I wouldn't be here. And he wasn't telling me what was happening, but he kept referring to alcohol. And because, as noted, I have had my problems with alcohol, at that point I started trying to tell him that probably the head in the refrigerator had something to do with alcohol.
Although Dahmer had harbored dark fantasies about killing men and engaging in necrophilia since the age of 14, it wasn't until after his high school graduation in June 1978 that he began to act on these urges. Dahmer's first victim was Stephen Hicks, a hitchhiker he picked up while living with his parents in the affluent community of Bath, Ohio. The two drank beer and had sex, but when Hicks tried to leave, Dahmer could not bear the thought of being abandoned. In a violent outburst, he struck Hicks in the head with a barbell, killing him instantly. To dispose of the body, Dahmer dismembered it and placed the pieces in plastic garbage bags, burying them in the woods behind his family's home.
I always knew that it was wrong, but after the first killing was not planned. I was coming back from the shopping mall back in '78. I had fantasies about picking up a hitchhiker and taking him back to the house and having complete control and dominance over him.
That fall, he briefly attended Ohio State University, but was soon expelled for poor grades. In late 1978, he joined the Army and was stationed in Germany. Dahmer did not kill anyone during his time in the Army, a fact confirmed by an extensive investigation conducted by German authorities. After a couple of years, the Army discharged him due to his struggles with alcoholism. He then moved to Florida for a short period before returning to Ohio. Once back home, he unearthed Stephen Hicks' remains, mutilated the decomposing body with a sledgehammer, and scattered the remains across the woods. A few months after his October 1981 arrest for drunken and disorderly conduct, Jeffrey's father decided it would be best for him to move in with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin, hoping it might offer some stability. Things seemed calm for a short while, until one evening, after drinking, Dahmer dropped his trousers in front of a group of people. For the next 4 years, Dahmer managed to keep his behavior in check, but in September 1986, he was arrested once more, this time for masturbating in front of 2 young boys. He was sentenced to 1 year of probation. In September of 1987, Dahmer would kill his second victim, Stephen Toomey, in a hotel room. Dahmer and Toomey had been drinking heavily at a popular gay bar that night. Dahmer was unsure how he had killed him, but when he awoke the next morning, Toomey was dead, and Dahmer had blood on his mouth.
Was just going to spend the night with him. When I woke up in the morning, my forearms were bruised, and his chest was bruised, and blood was coming out of his mouth. He was hanging over the side of the bed, and I have no memory of beating him to death, but I must have.
In a panic, he purchased a large suitcase, stuffing the dismembered body inside to dispose of it later. After he took Toomey's corpse to his grandmother's basement, he had sex with it, masturbated on it, dismembered it, and threw it in the garbage. Several months later, he selected his third victim, a 14-year-old Native American boy named Jamie Doxeter, who hung around outside the gay bars, looking for relationships. Dahmer's methods had become established by that time. Normally, he would meet and select his prey at gay bars or bathhouses. He would lure his victims by offering them money for posing for photographs or simply to enjoy some beer and videos. Then he would drug them, strangle them, masturbate on their bodies, or have sex with the corpses, dismember the bodies, and dispose of them. Dahmer occasionally kept skulls or other body parts as grisly souvenirs of his victims. He followed this ritual with Richard Guerrero, a striking young man of Mexican descent. In late March 1988, Dahmer claimed he met Guerrero at a gay bar in Milwaukee, but Guerrero's family later insisted that their son was heterosexual. By the summer of 1988, Dahmer had already taken the lives of 4 men. While his grandmother remained unaware of the horrifying acts happening in her basement, she was very much aware of the noise and chaos caused by Jeffrey's drunken behavior and the late-night visits from his male companions. It was clear that something had to change. On September 25, 1988, Jeffrey Dahmer moved into an apartment on North 24th Street in Milwaukee. The very next day, he found himself in trouble. He lured a 13-year-old Laotian boy with the promise of $50 to pose for pictures. Dahmer drugged the boy and molested him, though he did not resort to violence or sexual intercourse. The boy's parents quickly noticed something was wrong and took him to the hospital, where doctors confirmed he had been drugged. Police later arrested Dahmer at his job as a chocolate mixer at Ambrosia Chocolate, charging him with sexual exploitation of a child and second-degree sexual assault. On January 30, 1989, Dahmer pleaded guilty to the charges but claimed he believed the boy was much older than his actual age. While awaiting sentencing, Dahmer moved back in with his grandmother. It was during this time that he met Anthony Sears, a 24-year-old black man, at a gay bar. As he had done before, Dahmer offered Anthony Sears money to pose for photographs. Once they arrived at his grandmother's house, Dahmer drugged and strangled Sears. He then engaged in necrophilic acts with the body before dismembering it. Ann Schwartz later detailed these horrific events in her book. Dahmer preserved a human head by boiling it to remove the flesh, later painting the skull gray to disguise it as a plastic medical model. He kept the skull as a trophy for 2 years. until it was recovered from his apartment on July 23, 1991. Dahmer later admitted that he derived sexual pleasure from masturbating in front of the skulls. On May 23, 1989, Dahmer's defense attorney, Gerald Boyle, and assistant district attorney, Gail Shelton, presented their respective cases to Judge William Gardner. Shelton argued for a prison sentence of at least 5 years, citing the bleak prognosis for Dahmer's rehabilitation. She noted that Dahmer's belief that his only wrongdoing was choosing a victim who was too young reflected his refusal to acknowledge the depth of his psychological issues. Despite appearing cooperative on the surface, Dahmer's behavior suggested deep-seated anger and unresolved mental health problems. 3 psychologists who evaluated him concluded that Dahmer was manipulative, resistant, and evasive. The psychologists recommended hospitalization and intensive treatment for Dahmer, but his defense attorney, Gerald Boyle, argued that Dahmer was ill and needed therapy rather than incarceration. Boyle highlighted that Dahmer had held down a job, which he saw as evidence of his potential for rehabilitation. Boyle further claimed that Dahmer had been caught before his crimes escalated further, presenting it as a blessing in disguise. Dahmer himself took the stand, attributing his actions to his struggles with alcoholism. His testimony was articulate and convincing. Given the dark secret he had been hiding, he had already murdered multiple men. "What I have done is very serious," he said. "I've never been in this position before. Nothing this awful. This is a nightmare come true for me. If anything would shock me out of my past behavior patterns, it's this. The one thing in my life that remains stable and gives me a sense of pride is my job," Dahmer continued. "I've come very close to losing it because of my actions, and I take full responsibility for what I've done. All I can do now is beg you to spare my job. Please give me a chance to prove that I can turn my life around and avoid making any more mistakes like this. Enticing a child was the climax of my idiocy. I want help. I truly want to change." Dahmer's performance in court was a masterful display of manipulation, typical of a psychopath. The judge, unfortunately, was persuaded and issued a sentence of probation for 5 years, with 1 year to be spent in the House of Correction under a work release program. This allowed Dahmer to leave the facility during the day for work but return to jail at night. 10 months later, the judge granted him early release, despite a letter from Dahmer's father urging that he remain incarcerated until he received proper treatment. Dahmer moved back in with his grandmother in March 1990, but the terms of his stay required him to find his own apartment. On May 14, 1990, Dahmer moved into apartment 213 at 924 North 25th Street, marking the beginning of a more intense phase of his killing spree. Over the next 15 months, Dahmer murdered 12 men, and his rate of killing reached a peak between May and July of 1991, when he was committing murders almost weekly. Most of his victims were black, though he also murdered a white man, a Laotian man, and a Hispanic man. The victims' ages ranged from 14-year-old Conorak to 31, with most identifying as homosexual or bisexual, though not all. Many of Dahmer's victims were living what police described as high-risk lifestyles, often involving drug use, prostitution, or homelessness. Most had criminal records, with offenses ranging from arson to sexual assault, rape, and battery. A detailed list of the victims can be found in Ann Schwartz's The Man Who Could Not Kill Enough. Dahmer's method for luring, killing, and disposing of his victims was disturbingly consistent. He often invited men to his apartment under the pretense of watching explicit videos or posing for photographs. Once there, he would drug them by crushing up prescribed sedatives and mixing them into drinks. After the victims were incapacitated, Dahmer would strangle them with his hands or a leather strap. He then often engaged in sexual acts with the corpses and masturbated on them afterward. Before cleaning up the scene, Dahmer would take Polaroid photographs of the entire process, ensuring that he could relive the experience at a later time. Dahmer would then cut open his victims' torsos, fascinated by the color of the internal organs. He was sexually aroused by the warmth emitted by the freshly killed bodies. Following this, he would dismember the victims, photographing each stage of the process for later enjoyment. Most of the bodies were disposed of using chemicals and acids that dissolved the flesh and bone, leaving behind a foul-smelling sludge that he could flush down the drain or toilet. Some body parts, however, were kept as trophies, particularly genitals and heads. The genitals were preserved in formaldehyde, while the heads were boiled to remove the flesh. Once the skulls were clean, Dahmer painted them gray, making them resemble plastic medical models. Cannibalism is not uncommon among necrophiliacs, and Dahmer admitted to eating the flesh of his victims. He believed that consuming their flesh would allow them to live on inside him. He experimented with different seasonings and meat tenderizers to enhance the taste of human flesh, which he claimed gave him sexual arousal. His freezer contained strips of frozen human flesh. Dahmer also experimented with drinking human blood, though he found it unappealing. Much like infamous murderer Ed Gein, Dahmer sought to perfect the techniques of preservation and taxidermy, hoping to apply these skills to his victims. For Dahmer, control was paramount. He could not tolerate rejection or abandonment, and this drove his actions in his relationships, even his homosexual ones. Rather than seeking to please his sexual partners, he was solely focused on fulfilling his own desires. To him, pleasure meant engaging in oral or anal sex with his partner whether they were alive or dead. His obsessive need for control led him to some deeply disturbing practices, including a crude form of lobotomy. After drugging his victims, Dahmer would drill holes into their skulls and inject muriatic acid into their brains. This usually resulted in immediate death, although one victim survived in a minimally functioning state for a few days before succumbing. Unsurprisingly, Dahmer's obsession with control led him to explore Satanism. He felt that possessing the bodies of his victims imbued him with a sense of malevolent power. In one of his confessions, Dahmer questioned whether there was an evil force in the world and whether he had been influenced by it. Although he was unsure about the existence of a higher power or the devil, he admitted that he had been contemplating both more deeply in recent times.
If a person doesn't think that there is a God to be accountable to, then what's the point of trying to modify your behavior to keep it within acceptable ranges? That's how I thought anyway. And I've since come to believe that the Lord Jesus Christ is truly God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. They're the only true God.
Dahmer had grand plans for his apartment, intending to create a shrine made up of his trophies, a griffin statue, and incense burned in the skulls of his victims. He believed that by doing so, he would gain special powers and energies that would help him in his social and financial life. Why does someone like Jeffrey Dahmer come into being? How does a man transform into a serial killer, necrophiliac, cannibal, and psychopath? Despite the myriad of books that attempt to explain the roots of his depravity, convincing answers remain elusive. Many theories point to factors such as childhood abuse, poor parenting, head trauma, fetal alcohol syndrome, or drug addiction as possible explanations. While these elements may contribute to certain individuals' descent into violence, they do not adequately explain Jeffrey Dahmer's behavior. Jeffrey Dahmer's father, Lionel, penned a deeply emotional and poignant memoir titled A Father's Story. In it, he examines the heartbreaking reality faced by many parents, the struggle to provide their child with a good upbringing, only to realize, too late, that their child has built an emotional wall, making it nearly impossible for the parents to reach them. While most parents are fortunate enough not to raise a child like Jeffrey Dahmer, many have watched their children spiral into addiction, crime, and despair, despite their best and most desperate efforts to intervene. Lionel's book reflects the tragic sense of parental helplessness, the feeling that their child has slipped beyond their control, drifting into a dark, uncontrollable void. Lionel Dahmer was candid in acknowledging the negative influences in his son Jeff's life. No family is perfect, and Jeff's mother had her own struggles, suffering from various physical ailments and exhibiting a high-strung temperament. Her childhood had been marred by her father's alcoholism, which left a lasting impact on her. Lionel, a chemist who later earned his Ph.D., spent long hours at work, perhaps as a means of avoiding the tension at home. Ultimately, Jeff's parents' marriage ended in divorce when Jeff was 18. Despite these family troubles, however, none of these common domestic issues can explain the extreme behaviors Jeff later exhibited, including serial murder, necrophilia, and his other disturbing actions.
Jeffrey's secret homosexuality was only one force that drove him into his own world. His parents' incessant fighting was another.
It was unnerving, depressing, made me angry sometimes. I'd leave the house, go out in the woods and sulk, brooding, wondering why they had to have such a rough relationship.
Jeffrey Dahmer was born in Milwaukee on May 21, 1960, to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. He was a wanted and cherished child, despite the complications that arose during Joyce's pregnancy. His birth was celebrated by his parents, and he grew up as a healthy, happy child. As a young boy, he was bubbly and playful, enjoying toys like stuffed bunnies and wooden blocks. He also had a beloved dog named Frisky. Although Jeff suffered from more frequent ear and throat infections than other children, he otherwise appeared to be a typical and well-adjusted young boy. Lionel Dahmer remembered a moment of simple joy when he, his wife Joyce, and Jeff released a bird they had nursed back to health after it was injured. Lionel cradled the bird gently in his hand, lifted it into the air, and then released it. The bird flew away, and the family shared a sense of wonder and happiness. Jeff's eyes gleamed with delight, and Lionel reflected that it may have been the happiest moment of his life. This memory stood out as a rare, pure moment of familial connection and happiness. The Dahmer family had moved to Iowa, where Lionel pursued his Ph.D. at Iowa State University. When Jeff was 4 years old, Lionel came across the remains of some small animals that had been killed by civets under their house. As Lionel gathered the tiny bones, Jeff was oddly fascinated by the sound they made. His small hands eagerly dug through the pile of bones, and the unusual interest he displayed in them unsettled his father. Over time, Lionel would reflect that this was no mere childish curiosity, it was something deeper, a fascination that he could no longer dismiss as a passing phase. The sense of something dark and ominous, of a disturbing force slowly taking root within Jeff, began to overshadow Lionel's memories of his son. At 6 years old, Jeff had to undergo surgery for a double hernia, but the procedure seemed to mark the beginning of a deeper change. After the surgery, he never regained his earlier cheerfulness or energy. He seemed more fragile, withdrawn, and distant. He spent long stretches sitting quietly, his face eerily still, almost as if he were shutting out the world around him. In 1966, Lionel completed his graduate studies in Iowa and took a position as a research chemist in Akron, Ohio. Joyce was also pregnant with their second son, David. By this time, Jeff was in first grade, and his personality began to shift in unsettling ways. He developed a deep fear of others, an anxiety that seemed to isolate him further. Along with a growing lack of self-confidence, Jeff became increasingly reluctant to embrace change. He clung to the comfort of familiar surroundings and found the idea of going to school particularly distressing. The lively, confident child Jeff had once been seemed to vanish, replaced by a shy, withdrawn boy who struggled to communicate with others. Lionel believed that the move from Iowa to Ohio was the root cause of Jeff's behavior, attributing it to the stress of being uprooted from familiar surroundings and thrust into new, unfamiliar ones. Having suffered from shyness and insecurity himself as a child, Lionel assumed his son would eventually overcome these challenges, just as he had. However, Lionel failed to recognize the gravity of Jeff's condition. What seemed like typical childhood shyness was, in reality, a much deeper and more isolating problem. Jeff was beginning to retreat further into himself, and his isolation was becoming more pronounced. In April of 1967, the family moved into a new house. Jeff appeared to adjust to the change more easily this time, and formed a close bond with a boy named Lee. He also became fond of one of his teachers, and even brought her a bowl of tadpoles he had caught. However, when Jeff learned that the teacher had given the tadpoles to Lee, something darker in him emerged. In a fit of anger and jealousy, Jeff snuck into Lee's garage and killed all the tadpoles with motor oil. This incident was a troubling sign that Jeff's struggles were not simply a phase, and things did not improve as time passed. Between the ages of 10 and 15, Jeff's physical appearance and demeanor underwent a profound transformation. The loose-limbed, energetic boy was replaced by a rigid, tense figure who carried himself with an unusual stiffness. His body appeared unnaturally straight, and he became more introverted, retreating into himself further. When others approached him, he would become visibly tense and uncomfortable. More often than not, he would isolate himself in his room, staring vacantly at the television. His expression was empty, and he seemed perpetually disengaged, as though trapped in a state of aimless, melancholic apathy. During this time, Jeff had one close friend, but by age 15, that friendship began to fade. It was later revealed during Jeff's trial that, around this period, he developed an unsettling habit. He would drive around with plastic garbage bags, collecting the remains of roadkill for a private collection. He would strip the flesh from the decaying bodies and, in one instance, even mounted a dog's head on a stake. While some have suggested that Jeff tortured animals, this seems unlikely. He had kept pets, including dogs, cats, and fish, throughout his childhood and into adulthood. His fascination, it seemed, was not with causing harm to living creatures, but with the macabre process of death and decomposition. As Jeff grew older, he became even more passive and withdrawn. His communication skills deteriorated, and he began answering questions with barely audible one-word responses. His world, once confined to the familiar realm of family and school, now seemed to shrink further as he retreated into a darker, more disturbing fantasy life. In the years to come, these fantasies would consume him. He became increasingly fixated on the stillness of the dead, with their lifeless forms fueling his growing sexual desires. Unable to articulate these strange, disturbing thoughts, Jeff grew even more isolated, severing his connections with the outside world. While other boys his age pursued careers, education, and relationships, Jeff remained aimless and unmotivated, unable to find a purpose beyond his own twisted fantasies. By this time, Jeff likely saw himself as entirely separate from the human community. He felt disconnected from all that was normal, acceptable, or even understandable to others. The disturbing fantasies of death and dismemberment that took over his mind as a teenager might have been expected to manifest in more obvious signs of mental illness, yet Jeff remained eerily unremarkable on the outside. He withdrew further, becoming uncommunicative and passive. Far from rebelling against his parents, he seemed indifferent to everything around him, as though nothing mattered. In high school, Jeff's grades were average, and he participated in a few extracurricular activities like tennis and the school newspaper. But his classmates saw him as a loner and an alcoholic, someone who often brought liquor into class. He was already beginning to separate from the typical teenage experiences, retreating into his own isolated world. In an odd twist, Jeff did manage to get a prom date, though his behavior afterward was bizarre. He invited his date to his parents' house for a seance, a further indication of his growing detachment from reality. His classmates also remembered a prank Jeff pulled when he managed to sneak his way into the yearbook photo of the National Honor Society, even though he wasn't a member. The yearbook staff noticed the stunt just in time and blacked out Jeff's image. As Jeff's behavior became more passive and erratic, tensions between Lionel and Joyce escalated, eventually leading to their divorce when Jeff was nearly 18. The divorce sparked a custody battle over their younger son, David. Several months after the divorce, Lionel remarried. His new wife, Sherry, did not share the same leniency towards Jeff's growing alcoholism that Lionel had once shown. Together, they persuaded Jeff to consider going to college. In the fall of 1978, Lionel and Sherry drove him to Ohio State University, but Jeff's alcohol problem proved impossible to ignore. He stayed drunk throughout the semester and flunked out. By this point, his addiction was well known, but Jeff refused any help. Lionel laid down the law. Jeff either needed to get a job or join the military. When Jeff continued to refuse work and remained drunk, Lionel took him to a recruiting office in January 1979, where he enlisted in the Army. From then on, Jeff's life became a chaotic cycle of ups and downs, and Lionel and Sherry's hopes for his recovery would continue to be dashed. For brief periods, Jeff would seem to show signs of stability, only for things to fall apart again. He seemed to enjoy his time in the Army, but his service was cut short due to his habitual drunkenness. Afterward, Jeff moved in with his grandmother and found a job, but even this stability was fleeting. He was arrested for drunkenness and disorderly conduct, and as his alcoholism and emotional troubles grew worse, his behavior became more erratic. His offenses escalated over time, moving from public drunkenness to more severe criminal acts, including child molestation. Eventually, the most horrifying revelation came when Jeff was arrested for multiple murders. Through it all, Lionel never gave up on his son. He paid for lawyers, encouraged Jeff to seek help, and prayed that his son might finally improve. But each time, Lionel's hopes were crushed by another tragic turn. By 1989, when Jeff was facing sentencing for child molestation, Lionel came to a painful realization his son was beyond his reach. Jeff had become everything Lionel had feared: an alcoholic, a thief, a liar, an exhibitionist, and a child molester. Lionel could no longer comprehend how his son had descended into such darkness. For the first time, he stopped believing that his love and resources could somehow save Jeff. Something was fundamentally missing in Jeff: a conscience, perhaps that either never existed or had long since died. It was as if Jeff was a hollow shell, unable to connect with humanity in any meaningful way. Dr. James Fox, Dean of the College of Criminal Justice at Northeastern University in Boston and a renowned expert on serial killers, has stated that, in hindsight, there was nothing anyone could have done to predict the tragedy of Jeffrey Dahmer. While Jeff's behavior was bizarre and disturbing, there were no clear signs that would have pointed to his future crimes. Fox also emphasized that, although Jeff was clearly devastated by his mother's departure, blaming his parents for what he became would be unjust. The trend of blaming parents for their children's actions, a notion that traces back to Sigmund Freud, is flawed in this case. Ultimately, Fox argues the responsibility lies with Dahmer alone, not with his father, his family, or even the police. Dr. Fox views Dahmer as an unusual case in the realm of serial killers. While many serial killers fit the stereotype of someone who is driven by power and control, Dahmer was different. Most killers derive their satisfaction from the act of killing itself, from tying up victims and savoring their fear and screams, which makes them feel superior and in control. Dahmer, however, found his thrill not in the murder, but in what happened after the victim died. His obsession lay in the post-mortem phase, where he could manipulate and control his victims in death, an act that was deeply rooted in his fantasy life. Dahmer's fixation on having total control over others intertwined with a self-loathing, and it seemed that his victims were simply an outlet for that hatred, which he projected onto them. It's possible that Dahmer's discomfort with his own sexual orientation played a crucial role in his crimes. If he struggled with his identity, it would make sense that he projected that internal conflict onto his victims, punishing them in a twisted effort to punish himself. His crimes: serial murder, psychopathology, necrophilia, and cannibalism are extreme, but not unique to modern times. Throughout history, similar phenomena have occurred, and explanations for them come and go with the times. Today, genetic explanations for criminal behavior are gaining traction over older psychological theories. In Dahmer's case, genetics may offer the most plausible explanation for his descent into madness and murder. The security surrounding Jeffrey Dahmer's trial was unlike anything Milwaukee had ever seen. The courtroom was thoroughly swept for explosives, with a bomb-sniffing dog used to ensure safety, and everyone entering the courtroom underwent a full search with a metal detector. A massive 8-foot barrier of bulletproof glass and steel was erected to isolate Dahmer from the gallery. Out of the 100 available seats, 23 were designated for reporters, 34 for the families of the victims, and the remaining 43 for public spectators. The courtroom drama unfolded with key players Judge Lawrence C. Graham Jr., District Attorney Michael McCann, and Defense Attorney Gerald Boyle, who had previously represented Dahmer. Throughout the trial, Lionel and Sherry Dahmer attended each day, their presence underscoring the family's ongoing emotional struggle. On January 13, 1992, in a dramatic twist, Jeffrey Dahmer ignored his lawyer's advice and changed his plea to guilty by reason of insanity. This shift in strategy completely upended the case. As noted by Don Davis in the Milwaukee murders, it set the stage for a grisly and unprecedented courtroom spectacle. Defense attorney Gerald Boyle's task now was to convince the jury that Dahmer was insane, that only someone out of their mind could commit the horrific acts he had. Meanwhile, District Attorney Mike McCann fought to prove that Dahmer was fully aware of his actions and understood that they were wrong. McCann argued that Dahmer was not a madman, but a cold-blooded psychopath who meticulously lured and murdered his victims. Prospective jurors were warned about the disturbing nature of the evidence they would be exposed to. Gerald Boyle informed them that they would hear about acts of sexual violence before, during, and after death. He asked whether they would be so disgusted by the details that they wouldn't be able to listen to the proceedings. Together, Boyle and McCann worked to eliminate jurors who might have biases against homosexuality or those skeptical of psychiatric experts. On the second day of jury selection, Boyle made an unsettling move. He held up a tabloid with the headline, "Milwaukee Cannibal Killer Eats His Cellmate," underscoring the sensational nature of the case. On January 29, 1992, the jury was finalized, consisting of 6 white men, 7 white women, and 2 alternates. The selection process caused an uproar, particularly because only one black person was chosen, which many saw as racially biased, especially given that most of Dahmer's victims were African American. The racial tension in the case was palpable, reflecting the deep divisions in the community. Boyle's defense strategy relied on 45 witnesses, including psychiatrists, who would try to demonstrate that Dahmer's sexual and mental disorders played a key role in his inability to understand the nature of his crimes. The trial became a gruesome showcase of Dahmer's alleged actions and twisted thoughts. Every horrifying detail, no matter how depraved, was laid out for the jury to consider. The defense's goal was clear: to convince the jury that such horrific acts and thoughts could only come from someone who was not in control of their faculties, someone who was insane. Boyle posed a pivotal question to the jury: was Dahmer evil, or was he simply sick? At that moment, it seemed possible that the jury might lean toward an insanity verdict. However, when it was McCann's turn to argue, he struck back forcefully. He painted Dahmer as a master manipulator who knew exactly what he was doing at every turn. Dahmer's actions, McCann argued, were not the result of madness but the product of careful, calculated planning. He could turn his urges on and off with ease, and this was not the behavior of a madman but a cold, methodical killer. 2 detectives took the stand, reading from the 160-page confession that Jeffrey Dahmer had written. It was a chilling account of his crimes, detailing the depth of his sexual perversion and twisted fantasies. Detective Dennis Murphy spoke of how Dahmer confessed to feeling immense guilt for what he had done, describing himself as thoroughly evil. Murphy quoted Dahmer's own words, "It's hard for me to believe that a human being could have done what I've done, but I know that I did it." Dahmer himself admitted that, although he was terrified of being caught, his fear was eclipsed by the overpowering thrill he derived from having complete control over his victims. The trial became a battle of psychiatric experts who struggled to determine whether Dahmer was legally responsible for his actions or whether his mental state had truly rendered him incapable of controlling them. This confusion left the jury grappling with the complexities of Dahmer's behavior. In his closing argument, Gerald Boyle presented a visual chart for the jury that took the form of a wheel, with Jeffrey Dahmer at the center. Each spoke of the wheel represented a different aspect of his deviant skulls in his locker: cannibalism, sexual fetishes, drilling into his victims' skulls, attempting to create zombies, necrophilia, his constant alcohol consumption, efforts to create a shrine, lobotomies, defleshing bodies, calling taxidermists, visiting graveyards, masturbating over his victims. Boyle's summation portrayed Dahmer as a runaway train, a man consumed by madness and utterly out of control. Mike McCann fired back sharply, countering that Dahmer was not a runaway train but rather the engineer driving it. He argued that Dahmer's actions were not the result of mental illness, but a calculated effort to fulfill his extreme sexual desires. McCann urged the jury not to be deceived by the facade Dahmer had constructed. "He fooled a lot of people," McCann said, "but please, don't let him fool you." After 5 hours of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. They concluded that Jeffrey Dahmer was not a man to be locked away in a hospital for the mentally ill, but rather someone who belonged in a prison cell for the rest of his life. On all 15 counts, Jeffrey Dahmer was found guilty, and the jury determined that he was legally sane at the time of the murders. N. Schwartz, who covered the case for the Milwaukee Journal, noted how disconcertingly normal Dahmer appeared in court, both in his demeanor and his speech. When Dahmer read his statement to the court, calmly and eloquently, Schwartz admitted that he couldn't help but wonder how easily people could be deceived by him. Dahmer's apology, spanning 4 typewritten pages, was a chilling reflection on his years of horrific crimes. In part, it read, "Your Honor, it is now over. This has never been a case of trying to get free. I didn't ever want freedom. Frankly, I wanted death for myself."
Your Honor, it is over now. This has never been a case of trying to get free. I didn't ever want freedom. Frankly, I wanted death for myself.
This was a case to tell the world that I did what I did, but not for reasons of hate. I hated no one. I knew I was sick or evil or both. Now I believe I was sick. The doctors have told me about my sickness, and now I have some peace. I know how much harm I have created. Thank God there will be no more harm that I can do. I believe that only the Lord Jesus Christ can save me from my sins. I ask for no consideration. Jeffrey Dahmer was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, amounting to a total of 957 years in prison. At the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, Dahmer initially adjusted well to prison life. To ensure his safety, he was kept apart from the general population. However, Dahmer, who appeared to be a model prisoner, eventually convinced prison officials to allow him greater interaction with other inmates. He was permitted to eat in communal areas and assigned janitorial duties alongside other inmates. Strangely, Dahmer was paired with 2 highly dangerous men on a work detail: Jesse Anderson, a murderer who had killed his wife, and Christopher Scarver, a schizophrenic inmate with delusions of being the son of God. Jesse Anderson, a white man convicted of murdering his wife and framing a black man for the crime, and Christopher Scarver, a delusional schizophrenic who believed he was the son of God and was incarcerated for first-degree murder, made a dangerous pairing with Dahmer. Given Dahmer's history of targeting and butchering black men, it's not hard to understand why Scarver might have viewed him with extreme animosity. On the morning of November 28, 1994, the 3 men were left unsupervised as they performed janitorial work. When the guards returned after 20 minutes, they found Dahmer's head crushed and Anderson seriously injured. A bloody broom handle was left at the scene, possibly symbolic of Scarver's violent message. Jeffrey Dahmer was pronounced dead at 9:11 a.m.